Put the cuffs on her. The words sliced through the first-class cabin so sharply that even the steady hum of the engines seemed to fade for a second. At 35,000 feet above the Midwest, passengers who had been scrolling through their phones, sipping coffee, or staring out the window suddenly looked up. Every eye turned toward seat 3A. Jasmine Carter, 17 years old, sat perfectly still. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. Somehow, that made the moment even more unsettling. The flight attendant standing in the aisle, Nicole Bennett, folded her arms as if the decision had already been made. Around her, whispers spread row by row like a ripple moving across a lake. People glanced at Jasmine, then at each other, trying to understand what kind of teenager could create enough concern to stop the normal rhythm of a cross-country flight. The truth was simple. She hadn't. But by then, truth was already losing to assumptions. Jasmine wore a gray hoodie, black sneakers, and a pair of wireless headphones resting around her neck. Nothing about her looked threatening. Nothing about her explained the tension hanging over the cabin. Yet the story had started 20 minutes earlier with a complaint from a passenger who claimed she was acting suspiciously. Then another passenger repeated it. Then a crew member treated the rumor like fact. By the time the concern reached the cockpit, it had transformed into something entirely different. That was how these situations worked. One assumption became two. Two became certainty. Certainty became action. Now Jasmine sat surrounded by strangers who knew nothing about her except the version of her that had been created in the last few minutes. Across the aisle, a middle-aged businessman lowered his newspaper. A woman near the window quietly began recording with her phone. Farther back, a young flight attendant named Emily Foster watched the scene unfold with growing discomfort. She had been working the flight since boarding. She had seen Jasmine politely greet the crew. She had seen her thank a passenger who moved a carry-on bag. She had seen absolutely nothing that justified what was happening. Now, but experience had taught Emily something important. Speaking up against senior crew members was rarely welcomed. Nicole stepped forward again. Her expression remained cold, professional, certain. "Miss Carter, we need your cooperation." Jasmine slowly lifted her eyes. Calm, focused, unshaken. The kind of composure that didn't belong to most teenagers. For a brief moment, Nicole hesitated. Not because she doubted herself. Because Jasmine looked like someone who already knew how this story would end. Outside the windows, clouds stretched across the horizon in endless white layers. Inside the aircraft, the atmosphere felt charged, as if the entire cabin had become a courtroom. The accusation had already been made. The judgment seemed close behind. Yet Jasmine remained motionless, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't angry. She was waiting. And none of the people staring at her, not the passengers, not the crew, not even Emily, could have imagined that before this flight was over, every assumption made about that quiet girl in seat 3A would come crashing down. Jasmine Carter had learned something most adults never mastered. Silence was not weakness. Silence was control. While nervous whispers drifted through the cabin and curious eyes remained fixed on seat 3A, she sat calmly and watched the storm build around her. Her heartbeat stayed steady. Her breathing never changed. She had spent years learning how to remain composed when other people lost theirs. That lesson had started long before this flight. At 17, Jasmine was already known among her teachers as the student who never panicked under pressure. She carried a near-perfect grade point average, volunteered on weekends, and spent more time reading business biographies than scrolling through social media. Friends often joked that she sounded 30 instead of 17. What they did not know was that growing up as the daughter of Marcus Carter came with unusual lessons. Her father never taught her how to impress people. He taught her how to observe them. He often said that character revealed itself when people believed there would be no consequences. Jasmine remembered, sitting across from him at their kitchen table 2 years earlier. She had come home upset after being unfairly blamed for something during a school project. Marcus listened quietly before offering a piece of advice she never forgot. The moment you panic, you hand someone else the steering wheel. Stay calm and let people show you who they are. At the time, it sounded like a business lesson. Now, sitting thousands of feet above the ground while strangers judged her without evidence, those words echoed in her mind with surprising clarity. Across the aisle, passengers continued exchanging theories. Some believed there had to be more to the story. Others simply accepted whatever they had heard from the crew. That was the strange thing about assumptions. Once they took root, they spread faster than facts. Nicole Bennett seemed to understand that. She moved through the cabin with confident authority, speaking in a tone that suggested certainty even though very few questions had actually been asked. Every time she addressed another crew member, the atmosphere grew heavier. Every glance toward Jasmine carried a little more suspicion than before. Yet none of it matched reality. Jasmine had boarded normally. She had followed every instruction. She had spent most of the flight reviewing notes for an academic leadership conference waiting for her in Atlanta. The folder still rested neatly inside her backpack beneath the seat in front of her. Emily Foster noticed it. She noticed a lot of things. The conference badge attached to the bag. The Honor Society sticker on the notebook. The fact that Jasmine had thanked every crew member she interacted with. None of those details fit the narrative forming around her. Emily felt an uncomfortable knot growing in her stomach. Something was wrong. Not with Jasmine. With the situation itself. Meanwhile, Jasmine glanced briefly toward the window. Bright sunlight reflected off endless clouds stretching across the horizon. The view looked peaceful, almost disconnected from the tension filling the aircraft. Then she looked back toward the aisle and saw Nicole speaking quietly with another crew member. Their expressions were serious. Their decision seemed to be getting closer. Jasmine remained calm. But deep inside, she understood something important. The people around her were no longer trying to discover the truth. They were building a story, and stories built on assumptions rarely ended where anyone expected. The shift happened so gradually that most passengers did not notice it at first. No official announcement was made. No dramatic accusation echoed through the cabin. Yet the atmosphere around Jasmine continued changing with every passing minute. What had begun as uncertainty was hardening into belief. Nicole Bennett moved through the aisle with the confidence of someone who had already decided what the truth was. She spoke quietly with another crew member near the galley, then returned with an expression that seemed even more certain than before. A few passengers watched the exchange and immediately assumed it confirmed their suspicions. That was the power of perception. People often trusted confidence more than facts. A man seated 2 rows behind Jasmine leaned toward his wife and whispered something. She nodded without ever looking directly at Jasmine. Across the aisle, another passenger folded his arms and shook his head as though a verdict had already been reached. No evidence had appeared. No explanation had been offered. Yet the story continued growing on its own. Emily Foster felt increasingly uncomfortable. She had replayed the entire flight in her head several times and still could not identify a single moment that justified the tension surrounding seat 3A. The more she thought about it, the less sense it made. Jasmine had been quiet during boarding, quiet during takeoff, quiet throughout the flight. Yet somehow she had become the center of attention. Emily glanced toward the cockpit door where First Officer Daniel Brooks had emerged briefly to speak with Nicole. Their conversation lasted less than a minute, but the look they exchanged made Emily uneasy. It was the look of people preparing for action rather than investigation. Jasmine noticed it too. She watched Daniel disappear behind the cockpit door and then looked back out the window. The sunlight had shifted slightly, casting long reflections across the wing. Everything outside remained calm and predictable. Inside the cabin, however, assumptions continued multiplying. One passenger claimed he had seen Jasmine arguing earlier, even though no argument had occurred. Another insisted she had ignored crew instructions. Someone else repeated the claim as if it were established fact. The rumor no longer belonged to any one person. It had become a collective story. Jasmine recognized the pattern. She had seen smaller versions of it before. People rarely questioned information that matched their expectations. They simply passed it along. Nicole eventually stopped beside her seat once again. Her posture was rigid. Her voice carried the polished tone of professionalism, but something colder hid underneath it. "Miss Carter, we may need additional cooperation from you shortly." Jasmine met her gaze. For what reason? Nicole hesitated for a fraction of a second. "We are evaluating a situation." It was not really an answer. Jasmine knew it. Emily knew it. Even a few nearby passengers seemed puzzled by it. Yet nobody challenged the statement. Authority often filled the spaces where facts should have been. As Nicole walked away, Emily watched Jasmine carefully. Most teenagers would have shown frustration by now. Some would have demanded explanations. Others would have broken down under the pressure of being watched by an entire cabin. Jasmine did none of those things. She simply sat there, composed and observant, as though she understood something no one else did. And somewhere between Chicago and Atlanta, while rumors continued spreading from row to row, the distance between truth and assumption grew wider than ever. Emily Foster could no longer ignore the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The farther the situation moved from facts, the more uncomfortable she became. She stood near the galley pretending to organize service items while quietly replaying the flight from the beginning. Every memory pointed to the same conclusion. Jasmine Carter had done nothing unusual, nothing disruptive, nothing that justified the suspicion now surrounding her. Emily remembered watching her board with a polite smile and a backpack slung over one shoulder. She remembered seeing her thank an elderly passenger who needed help lifting a carry-on bag. She remembered noticing the leadership conference folder tucked neatly under her arm. None of those details matched the image being built around her now. Across the cabin, the rumors continued moving from seat to seat. The story had evolved so many times that people no longer seemed interested in whether it was true. They simply repeated what they had heard. Emily watched a passenger point discreetly toward Jasmine while whispering to someone across the aisle. Another passenger nodded immediately, as though confirmation had been delivered. The cabin no longer felt like a group of travelers sharing a flight. It felt like an audience watching a narrative unfold. Nicole Bennett remained at the center of it. Her confidence seemed to grow every time someone accepted her version of events without question. Yet Emily noticed something others did not. Nicole never actually explained what Jasmine had done. The accusations remained vague. The explanations remained incomplete. Every answer led to another unanswered question. That detail bothered Emily more than anything else. She glanced toward seat 3A again. Jasmine remained exactly where she had been. Calm, composed, patient. It was the kind of self-control Emily rarely saw even in seasoned executives who flew first class every week. There was something remarkable about the teenager's ability to remain steady while an entire cabin quietly judged her. Then Emily remembered something she had almost forgotten. During boarding, she had briefly checked passenger information while helping another crew member. The name Carter had caught her attention because it sounded familiar. At the time, she thought nothing of it. Now the memory returned with unexpected force. Emily slipped toward a service terminal near the galley and carefully reviewed the passenger manifest. A few seconds later, her eyes widened. Jasmine's reservation was completely valid. Every detail matched. No alerts, no warnings, no notes suggesting concern of any kind. In fact, the booking reflected a premium customer profile. Emily stared at the screen. The growing narrative inside the cabin suddenly seemed even more absurd. She looked back toward Jasmine and then toward Nicole. Something was not adding up. Before she could think twice, Emily approached Nicole quietly. "I checked the manifest again," she said carefully. "Everything appears normal." Nicole's expression hardened immediately. "That is not your concern." Emily hesitated. "But there is nothing here suggesting a problem." Nicole lowered her voice. "The situation is already being handled." The response felt less like an explanation and more like a warning. Emily stepped back, but the conversation only strengthened her doubts. As she returned to her position near the galley, she realized something important. Jasmine was not the problem. The real problem was that nobody seemed interested in proving she was innocent. And for the first time since the flight began, Emily decided she was going to pay attention to every single thing that happened next. The atmosphere inside the cabin changed the moment the captain's voice came over the intercom. It was calm, measured, professional, yet somehow it made the tension feel heavier. Passengers stopped whispering and listened. The announcement was vague, mentioning an onboard concern and requesting continued cooperation from everyone on the flight. No names were used, but every person in first class knew exactly who the message was about. Eyes drifted toward seat 3A once again. Jasmine Carter felt dozens of strangers looking at her, measuring her, judging her, constructing stories about her without knowing a single meaningful fact. For most people, that kind of attention would have been unbearable. For Jasmine, it awakened an old memory she had spent years trying to forget. She was 12 years old again, standing inside a department store during a holiday shopping trip. She remembered browsing through notebooks while waiting for her father to finish a phone call. She remembered an employee following her through multiple aisles. She remembered the uncomfortable feeling of being watched. Then came the questions. Questions asked with suspicion instead of courtesy. Questions based on assumptions rather than facts. Nothing serious happened that day, but the lesson stayed with her. She learned how quickly ordinary moments could change when someone decided they already knew who you were. Back in the aircraft cabin, the same feeling returned. Different place, different people, same invisible weight. A passenger several rows back raised a phone higher, recording openly now. Another passenger joined in. Within minutes, multiple cameras were pointed toward the situation. The flight no longer felt private. It felt public. Every glance seemed amplified. Every whisper carried farther. Emily Foster noticed it too. She watched Jasmine sitting alone under the attention of an entire cabin and felt a growing sense of guilt. Not because she had caused the situation, because she had allowed herself to remain silent for too long. Meanwhile, Nicole Bennett continued moving with the confidence of someone determined to justify a decision already made. She exchanged brief conversations with crew members and occasionally looked toward Jasmine as though expecting some dramatic reaction. None came. Jasmine remained calm. That calmness seemed to frustrate people more than resistance ever could. They wanted a story with clear roles. They wanted proof that their assumptions were correct. Instead, they found a teenager who refused to play the part they had assigned her. Outside the windows, afternoon sunlight painted the clouds in bright shades of gold and white. The view was peaceful enough to belong in a travel advertisement. Inside the aircraft, however, the emotional distance between Jasmine and everyone around her felt wider than the 1,000 miles remaining before Atlanta. Then something unexpected happened. Emily noticed tears forming in the eyes of an older woman seated across the aisle. The woman was not crying from fear. She was remembering something. A son, a grandson, a moment from years earlier that looked painfully familiar. She quietly lowered her gaze and shook her head. Jasmine saw it. For the first time during the entire ordeal, she realized she was not completely alone. Someone else in the cabin understood exactly what was happening. And although the humiliation surrounding her continued to grow, a small crack had finally appeared in the story everyone else was trying so hard to believe. The flight continued south toward Atlanta, but the emotional temperature inside the cabin seemed frozen in place. Every minute stretched longer than the last. The whispers had quieted, yet the silence felt even louder. People were waiting for something to happen. They just did not know what. Nicole Bennett stood near the front of the cabin speaking softly with First Officer Daniel Brooks. Their expressions carried the confidence of people who believed they were still in control. Emily Foster watched from a distance and wondered how long that confidence would last. The more she reviewed the facts, the more she realized there were almost none. There was suspicion. There were assumptions. There were rumors repeated often enough to sound true. But facts were strangely absent. Jasmine Carter understood that too. She sat quietly in her seat, looking far calmer than anyone expected. Her conference folder remained tucked beneath the seat in front of her. Her backpack rested exactly where she had placed it. Everything around her seemed unchanged except the way people looked at her. She had spent the last hour being transformed into a story she never volunteered to join. Yet her father had prepared her for moments like this long before she understood why. Marcus Carter often said that pressure revealed people more clearly than success ever could. Anyone could appear kind when circumstances were easy. Character appeared when power went unchallenged. Jasmine looked around the cabin and realized she was witnessing exactly that. Then she reached into her pocket and removed her phone. The movement was small, almost invisible among the tension surrounding her. No dramatic speech followed. No argument. No attempt to convince anyone of anything. She unlocked the screen and opened a message thread that had existed for years. Thousands of conversations. School updates. Family jokes. Advice before exams. Encouragement after difficult days. At the top of the thread was a simple name. Dad. Jasmine stared at the keyboard for several seconds. Not because she was afraid. Because she wanted every word to matter. Finally, she typed a single sentence. Dad, they are treating me like a criminal. She read it once. Then she pressed send. The message traveled silently through the network in less than a second. No one around her noticed. Nicole continued her conversations. Daniel remained focused on operational decisions. Passengers kept watching the situation from a distance. The moment felt insignificant. Yet some moments changed everything precisely because they looked ordinary. Jasmine locked her phone and slipped it back into her pocket. Then she leaned back in her seat and looked out the window once more. The clouds below appeared endless, peaceful, unaware of the storm unfolding above them. Emily noticed the brief exchange with the phone, but could not see the message itself. Still, something about Jasmine's expression changed afterward. Not relief, not satisfaction, certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from knowing help is not being requested. It is already on the way. And while the rest of the cabin remained focused on the story they thought they understood, events far beyond the aircraft had already begun moving in a completely different direction. By the time the aircraft began its descent toward Atlanta, the mood inside the cabin had shifted again. The confidence that had fueled the rumors was no longer as strong as it had been an hour earlier. People were starting to ask questions. Quiet questions. Careful questions. Questions that should have been asked from the beginning. Emily Foster noticed it first. Passengers who had once accepted every assumption without hesitation were now watching the crew instead of Jasmine. The direction of attention had changed. Nicole Bennett felt it too. She walked through the aisle with the same professional posture, but there was a slight tension in her movements that had not been there before. The certainty that once seemed effortless now looked forced. Outside the windows, the city of Atlanta appeared beneath scattered clouds, its highways and buildings growing larger with every passing minute. Inside the aircraft, no one seemed interested in the view. The cabin felt suspended between two realities. One was the story people had spent the flight believing. The other was the truth that had not yet arrived. When the wheels finally touched the runway, a strange silence settled across first class. Passengers normally reached for phones, adjusted bags, and prepared to leave. This time they remained seated longer than usual. They were waiting. Even if they could not explain why, they sensed the situation was not over. The aircraft rolled toward the gate and slowed to a stop. Seatbelt signs remained illuminated. Crew members exchanged brief glances. Then something unusual happened. No one opened the boarding door immediately. Several extra minutes passed. Nicole checked her watch. Daniel Brooks stepped out of the cockpit and spoke quietly with a ground employee through the forward window. Whatever he heard seemed to catch him off guard. Emily saw his expression change. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. Then came another delay. Passengers began looking around. Confusion spread through the cabin. Jasmine remained calm. Her expression had not changed since sending the message to her father. She simply sat there, waiting. Finally, the aircraft door opened. A rush of warm Georgia air entered the cabin. Most passengers expected to see airport staff. Instead, they saw something else. A group of sharply dressed professionals stood at the end of the jet bridge. Men and women carrying tablets, folders, and identification badges. Their presence immediately felt different. Intentional, organized, purposeful. Behind them stood a tall black man wearing a navy suit and a quiet expression. He was not rushing. He was not angry. He simply stood there with the confidence of someone who never needed to announce his importance. Several passengers glanced at him without recognition. Others sensed something unusual immediately. Emily felt a chill run through her. She had never seen the man before, yet the atmosphere around him seemed to alter the entire space. Conversation stopped. Even Nicole appeared uncertain for the first time all day. The man took a few calm steps forward into the doorway of the aircraft and looked directly toward Seat 3A. Jasmine saw him and smiled softly. It was the first smile anyone had seen from her since the flight began. And in that single moment, before a single word was spoken, the balance of power inside the cabin quietly changed. The tall man stepped fully into the aircraft, and the effect was immediate. Conversations died mid-sentence. Passengers who had spent the entire flight speculating suddenly found themselves watching in silence. Marcus Carter did not raise his voice. He did not rush toward anyone. He simply walked forward with the calm certainty of someone accustomed to being heard without demanding attention. The group accompanying him followed several steps behind, carrying company credentials, legal folders, and digital tablets. Nicole Bennett's confidence began to crack. She glanced toward Daniel Brooks, searching for reassurance, but his expression revealed the same uncertainty she felt. Emily Foster watched from the galley and immediately understood that this was no ordinary parent arriving to meet a child after a difficult flight. The atmosphere felt different, deliberate, serious. Marcus stopped beside seat 3A and looked directly at Jasmine. For a brief moment, The tension that had dominated the flight disappeared. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. Jasmine nodded. "I am now." Marcus offered a small smile before turning his attention toward the crew. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Nicole stepped forward first. "Sir, there has been a misunderstanding." Marcus looked at her calmly. "That is what I am here to determine." One of the professionals standing behind him opened a tablet and began reviewing records. Another quietly spoke with airport representatives waiting outside the aircraft. The efficiency of it all unsettled the crew more than anger ever could. Emily finally stepped forward. Her heart raced, but she knew remaining silent would be worse. "I reviewed the passenger manifest," she said. "Everything about Jasmine's reservation was valid from the beginning." The words landed heavily inside the cabin. Several passengers exchanged surprised looks. Emily continued. "I never found any evidence supporting the concerns that were being repeated." The silence that followed felt enormous. Marcus nodded once. "Thank you for speaking honestly." Then he looked toward the surrounding passengers. "How many of you witnessed what happened today?" Hands slowly began to rise. More than Nicole expected. More than Daniel expected. An older woman across the aisle spoke first. "I watched the entire thing. Nobody ever explained what she supposedly did wrong." Another passenger added. "Most of us were reacting to rumors. We never heard any facts." One by one, voices emerged. The story that had dominated the flight began unraveling. Not through confrontation, but through simple questions. Questions that should have been asked hours earlier. Marcus listened carefully before finally speaking. His voice remained calm, yet every word carried weight. "You saw a black teenager." "I saw my daughter." "The law sees a citizen." "What exactly did you see?" No one answered immediately. They did not need to. The question lingered over the cabin like a mirror, forcing everyone to examine themselves. Nicole lowered her gaze. Daniel folded his arms and looked away. For the first time since the flight began, the focus was no longer on Jasmine. It was on the decisions made around her. And as the truth continued coming into focus, the story people had spent hours believing began collapsing under the weight of its own assumptions. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The cabin that had been filled with whispers, assumptions, and certainty now sat in complete silence. The truth had arrived, and it was far less comfortable than the story people had created. Marcus Carter looked around the aircraft, not with anger, but with disappointment. Somehow that felt heavier. Anger could be dismissed as emotion. Disappointment forced people to confront themselves. The professionals accompanying him continued documenting statements and reviewing records. Every detail was being preserved. Every decision was being examined. Nicole Bennett stood motionless near the front of the cabin. Daniel Brooks remained quiet. Neither seemed interested in defending the assumptions that had guided the flight. There was very little left to defend. Emily Foster watched as passengers who had once accepted rumors without question now reflected on their own reactions. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked thoughtful. A few simply stared out the windows, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Marcus finally turned back toward Jasmine. "You handled this exactly the way I hoped you would," he said softly. Jasmine smiled. "You always told me that people reveal themselves under pressure." Marcus nodded. "And today they did." The statement was simple, yet it seemed to echo through the cabin. Because the story had never really been about one flight. It was about assumptions. About how quickly people could mistake confidence for truth. About how easily someone could be judged before being understood. One of the passengers who had recorded part of the incident slowly lowered her phone. "I owe you an apology," she said to Jasmine. A man across the aisle nodded in agreement. Then another passenger did the same. The apologies were not dramatic. They were sincere. And sincerity carried more weight than performance ever could. Emily stepped forward once more. "I should have spoken up sooner." Jasmine looked at her and shook her head gently. "You spoke up when it mattered." For the first time that day, Emily smiled. Marcus then addressed the cabin one final time. His voice remained calm, but every word seemed to settle into the room. "The goal was never to prove who my daughter is. The goal was to expose what happens when people stop asking questions and start making assumptions. Respect should not depend on status. It should not depend on wealth. It should not depend on who someone's family is. It should exist before any of those things are known." No one interrupted. No one argued. They simply listened. The lesson had become impossible to ignore. A few minutes later, passengers finally began gathering their belongings. The atmosphere felt completely different from the one that had existed only hours earlier. The tension was gone. The certainty was gone. In its place remained reflection. Jasmine picked up her backpack and conference folder. Marcus walked beside her as they moved toward the open aircraft door. Neither looked back. They did not need to. The story had already reached its conclusion. As father and daughter stepped into the jet bridge, sunlight streamed through the terminal windows ahead. Behind them, an entire cabin remained seated for a moment longer, quietly thinking about the difference between seeing someone and truly understanding them. And that was the lesson they would carry long after the flight was forgotten.